You're listening to the Generation to Generation podcast, episode 25. What does it look like for us as men to live a wholehearted life in a world that invites us to run after trinkets and plastic trophies? We so often run after power. That's something all men innately crave, but it often leads to self-harm or harm to those entrusted to our care. God didn't intend it to be this way. In this episode of the podcast, we are joined by author and speaker Morgan Snyder, whose new book, Becoming a King, The Path to Restoring the Heart of Man, paints a picture of masculinity, showing a path for men on what it looks like to grow as a man and to love well. For men or women, Morgan's words will be a source of encouragement. As always, thanks for listening. Joining us today is author and speaker Morgan Snyder. Morgan is a teacher, writer, and speaker. His passion is to both be shaped by and shape the men and women who are shaping the kingdom of God. In 2010, he established becomegoodsoil.com, a fellowship of leaders whose global reach offers guidance for the narrow road of becoming the kind of person to whom God can confidently entrust the care of his kingdom. He serves on the executive leadership team of Wild at Heart and Ransom Heart Ministries, having served alongside John and Stacy Eldridge for more than 2 decades. Morgan and his wife Sherry, his son Joshua, and his daughter Abigail live in the beautiful state of Colorado. Morgan, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Michael, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be on your show. It's an honor to be with your tribe. I'm really excited to dive into some of these things, and it sounds like we already have a lot of like-hearted passions and pieces in our story. So it's an honor to be with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Morgan. I've just really been looking forward to our conversation. And, as we were talking before the recording got started, just, God's faithfulness, a lot of overlap with godly men that have been involved in both of our lives. So just how small a world it is, and just the kingdom and brotherhood of Christ, just such a small world. So just really looking forward to this. And I think maybe a good place for us to get started, would, love if you could share with our listeners about your new book that's coming out, Becoming a King, what led you to write it, and just really the journey for all of us as men, becoming more of the men, that God created us to be.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. It started decades ago, actually. It's a recent chapter in a great story. But if I rewind the clock and just look at my life on the level of the soul, I was a young, passionate man looking for life. And I had no relationship with God. I wasn't raised with a worldview that was centered in Christ and his kingdom. And so I looked for life in all the wrong places. And I won the game, Michael. I remember being in high school and graduating high school, getting ready to go to college. And I remember that feeling of I won, like I had a beautiful girlfriend and straight A's and student government president, and I had lost my soul. I couldn't have put words to it well at the time, but I remember, Michael, looking in the mirror the night before I left for college, and I felt like I was a soulless person. I was literally a person without soul. I felt like if I died today, I would just simply have nothing to say about my life. And I was really perplexed because I was a dreamer and I didn't know where to turn. And I knew the answer was God, but I didn't know really how to find him. And so I started searching. And what happened was that I found that I was the one being hunted, that God was the one chasing me, Michael. But he was different than I had learned him to be in the religious cultures around me. He was a father that was generous and very caring and very particular in his invitation to become mature and wholehearted. And so I became a follower of God and his kingdom in college. I had a pretty radical conversion. But Michael, as I look back over those decades, what strikes me is I found myself being a man on the outside, but inside still feeling like so much of a boy. That I think there was a trust and a confidence in God, but there was still lack of wholeheartedness, I would say. There were parts of me that really hadn't received God. So there's parts of me that trusted, but there were other parts that were so bound in fear and a feeling of being behind and afraid. And so on the outside, I was killing it and accomplishing, and now doing it for God. But on the inside, I was still lonely and confused. And so it set me on a journey. And I began asking God the deep questions. Where's life found? How do I make it work? What is the meaning of this thing called life? What is the most important thing? And I sought God's heart. And I asked him those questions fervently. And for a couple of weeks, I just really sensed a silence. And the silence opened me up to even go deeper still. And over time, Michael, what I found is a sense from God of he wanted to speak, but he wanted to do it through the lives of older men. And so I turned to the oldest men I knew, and I respected, and I asked them those questions. What's the most important thing? How do we recover faith, hope, and love that really lasts? And it started with letters. People from a distant land would write in letters, and people locally, it might be a cup of coffee or a campfire and a cigar. And what I recovered in 2 years' time, I sat with over 75 men. And what I realized was it wasn't new, but it was newly recovered. You know, G.K. Chesterton, in his brilliant book, Orthodoxy, says every generation loses the gospel. And it's every generation that's charged with its recovery. And so I think what I would say is what I found is a recovering of the ancient path that Jeremiah talks about when he's speaking into a dark culture in Babylon, where he says, sons and daughters, we stand at the crossroads. Look, ask, where is the ancient path that leads for rest for the soul, life for the soul? And I began recovering that ancient path. And what I found was it was a path and a process. So it was 2 decades that I consented to a radical upside down kingdom, as the Tim and John from the Bible Project would say. It's an upside down kingdom where to become first, you actually have to become last, that there are no shortcuts that exist in kingdom realities, that slow and steady is actually the path of restoration, that to build, we actually have to excavate, that we have to take the lowest seat at the table. And in time, over 2 decades, it was a really consenting to a path and a process. It was choosing to be young, choosing to engage in true apprenticeship. And the fruit of those 2 decades, with much more behind it, but the fruit was God inviting me to write the message in a book, a video series, and an in-depth study guide of the treasures that I recovered, to make it available to other thirsty, like-hearted men that want to be restored and become the kind of men in whom God is glad to entrust more and more of the stewardship of his kingdom.
Yeah, Morgan, there's just so much in that that's just that you said that really just stands out to me, and just what a joy it's been just to read this book that you've put together just over just these years of experience and just wrestling to ask these questions and to kind of look back to this ancient path that you're speaking on. And we talked a little bit about this before the recording, as far as the importance of, I would say, I refer to them as gospel dads, as far as these older men and these father figures. And, as I read, your book, our family has actually been watching the ESPN documentary the past few weeks called The Last Dance about the 90s Chicago Bulls and Michael Jordan. And, you speak in terms of kingdom, as far as the empire and the kingdom of Michael Jordan, where it's just kind of interesting, even watching, presidents kind of tread carefully to be critical of Michael Jordan. But one of the things that really stood out to me in the last few episodes that just recently aired was just the importance of an older man named Gus Lett, who probably many people were not aware of, who, has since the time of this, Bulls championship runs, has passed away from cancer. But what stood out to me was this man who was a retired Chicago police officer and who had helped with Michael Jordan's security, in all intents and purposes, really became a surrogate father to Jordan after Michael Jordan's dad was shot and killed in 1993. And what stood out is, what you have is one of the most famous, wealthiest, I think his estimated worth is over $2 billion. One of the most powerful men in the world in many ways, who in his early 30s is really needing this older man in Gus Lett. And you mentioned how George MacDonald posed the question in his book Unspoken Sermons, how the question, how have you learned the Father? And what would you want the men who are listening to our conversation to know about the need that we have in our lives for these older men as we kind of walk this path?
Yeah, that's really deep waters. It's a beautiful story about Michael and about Gus. And doesn't it then make sense, right? You think of all of the heroes in culture and these powerful sports figures and how many of them they stumble and fall. How many of them have too much kingdom and not enough character, and when the pressure's on, they simply haven't become the kind of people that can be entrusted with it. And yet you have a guy like Michael Jordan, where you see behind the scenes, he's standing on the shoulders of a stronger man, right? That went before him. And I think what I would offer, when I think about it, Michael, of like the life of Christ, of whatever else we're seeing, when we see Jesus, what we see modeled is a father-centered view of reality. What we see embodied in his life is strength through dependency. That we think of Christ independently because we think of him as God and fully man, right? And we think about these theological ideas, but in fact, he was a fully human as a son. And his entire life he lived dependent upon his Father, right? What you see me doing, I do nothing apart from the Father. And they said, I pray that they would be one heart and mind with you as I am one heart and mind with you. Like, what would it be like to be one heart and mind with the Father of all fathers? And I think that fundamentally, this is where we err as men, from which every other error leads us astray. Where, like C.S. Lewis said, I believe in Christianity like I believe in the sun. I believe in it because I watch it rise every day, but by it, I see all other things. Like, I think the same thing would be true of a father-centered view of reality. That once we come to know God, not as we have learned him to be, but as the Father that he presents himself through the life of his Son and through the Scriptures and through creation, then it becomes an interpretive grid that changes everything. I think the way I describe it is, look at the symptoms. Look at the fruit in our life. You'll know it by its fruit. And Dallas Willard says actions reveal beliefs 100% of the time. And so if we just look at our actions and we chase down what are the fundamental beliefs, not our creedal statements, not our theology, but what our lives really say about what we believe based on our actions, most men live with a fundamental sense of being behind. They live with a fundamental sense of independence. Life is up to me. I need to make it happen. I need to build something. I need to build a bank account. I need to build a name. I need to get something going. And so long as life is about me, and I have an orphan-centered, a fear-centered view, we do something called engineering smallness. Brene Brown, that's her term. I just love it.
Yeah.
She says we engineer very small stories.
Yeah.
Right? But instead, when we come home to a father, Michael, my experience on a very emotive, intellectual, spiritual reality, what I feel is scarcity is replaced with abundance. Like fear is replaced with courage. Being behind is replaced with a sense of being on time. Independence is replaced with a sense of being cared for and responding to a God that's initiating my story. And so I believe that coming home to God as Father, not just in our mind, but in our practical experience of our everyday life, changes everything.
Yeah, I think it's so true. I mean, I think just even what you're saying, that father-centered view, and one of the quotes that you have in the book that just really stood out to me is where you talk about, Jesus's humility makes a way for us to become good and true kings in his image. But it's important for us to understand this, especially in light of how our religion and culture have often identified humility with passivity or acquiescence. Kingdom humility is really harness strength, not passivity or absence of strength, and
Yes.
that in that you really see, that the strength of Jesus and his, identity fully being connected to his father, having that father view, knowing who he was, knowing who his father is, that really allowed him to go out in strength. And, I was spending some time with a group of men a few weeks ago, and we were just kind of laughing together as men, just that moment, in the life of Christ where he's standing in front of Pilate, who was, for all intents and purposes, viewed as the most powerful man in that region, and he had probably
Yes.
thousands of men beg for their lives, in this very moment, and Jesus is standing in front of Pilate, saying, "Hey, I'm choosing to be here." And I think it's exactly with what you're saying, Morgan, as far as him knowing
Yes.
who his father is, and that where does Pilate's authority even come from? It comes from the Father.
Yes.
And so there's nothing for Jesus to be afraid of. And so this is where he wants to be. And Pilate is, and that's the thing I've always kind of kidded that I'm a visual guy, I'm a movie guy. And one of the
Yes.
things I'm really looking forward to in New Heavens and New Earth is just to replay moments in history. But I just would love to see
Mhm. Mhm.
Pilate's face when he's encountering just the masculine strength and this identity that's at rest, that's in his presence, something he's probably never seen before.
Yes, isn't it? I love that. One day when all things are restored, we'll get to see that
Yeah,
scene,
it'd be
right? We'll
great.
get to be there. And as you share that, I'm fascinated by that because I think it's not unlike Gladiator when
Yeah,
Maximus
yeah,
is in the arena facing Commodus, right?
yep,
And Commodus is encountering a man who knows who he is. He's a man who's become his name. Revelations talks about the white stone and this anomatsu. We're all given a name known only to God and ourselves. And the stature of a man who has become the kind of person who knows who he is. And what's fascinating about that passage that I'm thinking about today, Michael, is like Pontius Pilate also demonstrates such cowardice where he speaks the truth. He's like, guys, let me tell you the truth. Like, this guy, like, we have no basis to crucify him. And yet he bows to the demands of the people, saving his own reputation and washing his hands, thinking that that will absolve him. And so it may make his own conscience clear, but between God, he was a man entrusted with power, and he chose to fold because in that moment he chose to back down from what is true because it could cost him his prestige, his reputation, his authority. So it's a great picture of men entrusted with power and what they do with it.
yeah, yeah. And I think it's just even to what you're saying, Morgan, that that's one of the things I also appreciate is you just really bring up this theme of power in your book. And as I was reading what you're writing, just kind of reminded, recently seeing a podcast. It actually was a video of the podcast conversation between Jordan Peterson and a former Navy SEAL, Jocko Willink, where Peterson, is talking about masculinity, and here you have someone who does not profess to be a Christian. I think really, you know, giving a picture in one sense of what we see in this interaction between Christ and Pilate, where Peterson says, a harmless man is not a good man. A good man is a very dangerous man who has that voluntarily under control. And in your
Yes.
book, you write, we are meant to be powerful, and in order to become powerful, to become a wholehearted king, to become a man who can delight in the heart of God through what he does with power bestowed, we must take a journey down a rarely traveled and adventurous path. And, when we think about men in power, we think about the recent headlines and how power has been abused. And why do you think so few men, are equipped to wield power well?
Yeah, that's a very important question, because when we go back to the beginnings of our chapter in creation,
Mm-hmm.
what it reminds us is that we were all entrusted with power, Michael, right? It's just audacious to think that in this wildly creative story, that after creating, the heavens and the earth and night and dark and water and land and birds and animals, that God would say, let us, the Holy Trinity, make mankind in our image. And so male and female, he created us to be like him. Like, it's just madness to think that God would entrust us with that sort of power to literally bear the image of God. And then he goes on even more to say, and now let them rule. Let them subdue the earth and fill it. Let them exercise the character of God, the heart of God over all creation with this sort of fierce mastery. And so what I believe, it is in our DNA. The most important thing we can ever know about a human being is that they bear the image of God, that's the truest thing. Sin is not the truest thing. Brokenness is not the truest thing. Religion is not the truest thing. Choices are not the truest thing. The truest thing is that we bear the image of God. It's in there, right? And in there is an embodiment of power. And so we are created to rule. We are created to exercise of mastery over domain and steward something entrusted to our care. But without a whole heart, without a person who has taken the journey, a path and a process over time to mature, we never get beyond having to use our kingdom, to use our power to answer our own need for validation. And so that's what we see in the headlines. This morning I Googled the news, and the top 10 stories, 7 of them were stories of people in mishandling power entrusted to their care.
Yeah.
And so the question is, right, why does that happen? And I think if we look at the nature of the human heart, that the gospel is salvation, of course, but it's so much more. The gospel is a gospel of restoration, that in order for a person to become a steward, to become a good king and a good queen, they have to be wholehearted. They have to become a person that's able to bring love in heroically and authentically, to bring a strength on behalf of others. But I think most people never assent to the path and consent to the process of initiation. And so we simply never get beyond our own need to answer our question. And when you can either bring your question or bring your strength to the world, but you can't bring both at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
Do you notice that, Michael, playing
Yeah.
out? I'm curious, like for you and your story, where do you see that at work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the things that's, as you asked that, Morgan, just the reality that, in my own story, just, am I driven by fear or faith? Am I driven by the reality that, okay, where is my identity? Is it resting in what my Heavenly Father says or how he sees me? Or am I kind of quickly going to fear and shame, as a husband, as a father, as a pastor, as a counselor? And in one sense, that kind of wholeheartedness, the gospel is not just this one-time event, that the gospel, having to have it preached into my heart and believe it, afresh, anew every day. And, what we were talking about earlier, as far as why it's so critically important to have a gospel community and gospel dads reminding us of what is true as we're kind of walking down this path. So where,
Yes.
as we're in the midst of actually a transition where we're moving to where I'm taking a new call to a church in Birmingham, and
Okay.
having conversations with our 4 kids, and just our oldest son is about to become a senior in high school, and the reality of him having to move right before his senior year. And, in the midst of already everything that's been going on the past 2 months with the pandemic. And so, it's like, Lord, help me to be wholehearted and not be driven by fear and shame, so I can, by God's grace, not by my competency or by me being a perfect husband or perfect father, where I actually can be present for um, my son's anger, my son's celebration,
Yes.
my son's questions, and then in that, like, not feel like I have to have the perfect response. In one sense that, okay, Lord, I know that you are writing my son's story, and the story that I would have written for all four of my kids is very different than the one that you've written. But Lord, do I really believe that you love them and are committed to their goodness, their growth, um, more than I am? And, before,
Yes.
for all of our kids, when they turn 8, I give them an arrow, and we have this kind of this rite of passage through these different points in their life. But really kind of talking about the passage in the Psalms that, children, are arrows in the quiver of a father. And I talk to the kids that, arrows are not meant to gather dust. They're meant to, they're weapons of warfare, kingdom warfare, to go out and bring justice, to fight for good things, for them to be godly men, godly husbands, godly fathers, to be followers of Christ that are fearless. But in one sense, it kind of reminds me of that clip, with Will Smith and his son, The Pursuit of Happiness, where his son's like playing basketball, Morgan, and he's like, "Hey, I want to go pro. I want to be in the NBA." And the dad in this clip says, "Hey, you'll probably be good at a lot of things in life, but probably not playing basketball." And his son just becomes dejected. And his father kind of sees in that moment how he's kind of crushed his son's heart. And to his credit, in one sense, says, never let anyone tell you that you can't do something, even me. And so
Mm.
that's the thing, Morgan. I think, Lord, help me to listen to good voices. Help me to listen to the Father's voice. Help me listen to godly men and women on this path. And that's part of the reason why we wanted to do this podcast, is to be an encouragement to other brothers and sisters in Christ. And so that's a little bit of my thought as you're kind of sharing that, which I think is just really significant for all of us.
Yeah, I so appreciate that. First of all, Michael, I just want to celebrate you as a dad. Like, we don't get the privilege and the blessing to be celebrated as the heart is intended to be celebrated. And when I listen to you and I think of you being aware of the landscape of your son's soul as as you are moving to Alabama, and to think about what that affects, what that's like for a senior, as you're aware of his heart, as you're aware of your kids at 8, and you're inviting them into a larger story and showing them that they are powerful, but what they do with power will be increasingly up to them. Like, I just want to first of all celebrate, like, well done, Dad.
Yeah,
Well
I
done.
appreciate
You're
that.
doing it.
Yeah.
You're doing it. And the other piece I want to reflect back is, one of the things that's interesting. So when we're talking about like initiating our kids, is I've come to learn over these decades, and really what's embodied in becoming a king, is we can know Christ, and we can have a profession of faith and have a genuine faith in our heart, and we can still have parts of us, literally parts of our soul, that have been broken off through wounding, through spiritual warfare, and agreements that we make with lies, where actually parts of us are underdeveloped. They are uninitiated. They're immature. They're needing to be tended to and healed. And so I think it's really important to say the gospel is more than idea. It is actually embodied power that is intended to heal the whole human person over time. And my son's going through his initiation right now. He turns 16 next week, and
Yeah.
he has been doing a landscaping business to pay off the car that he bought, and
Hmm.
it's a big extension of his kingdom. It's a rite of passage. And but what I found, by way of example, we're both in a pastoral role. We're both in counseling roles. We're both in shepherding roles, fighting for the hearts of people, you and I.
Hmm.
And my son turning 15 last year, for about 3 months, he would make really good choices and it would throw me sideways. Like I would get off and I could not find my footing. And I couldn't understand why his good choices were like upsetting me from the inside. I was so disoriented by them. It took me 3 months to understand having a 15-year-old version of me outside of my body allowed me to reflect on the part of my soul that got actually really wounded at 15. I minimized it. I didn't see it until I had a 15-year-old me outside my body. And so then it was an invitation for God to father me back through some of those memories and understand that I was a young boy, and I didn't know at the time, but I was looking for dad. I was looking for older men. And what was put in the place of some of those older men were some real dark mentoring, some initiation into darkness of a real immoral path of life. And I needed to invite Christ to heal the 15-year-old in me. And so much of this past year was not only initiating my son as a 15-year-old, but actually at the same time allowing God to father us both and
Yeah.
allowing the 15-year-old in me to receive more healing. So I just want to give that encouragement to these men out there, as we are not talking about these two static versions where we are either by faith or by fear. Like, there are always in each of us portions of our soul that have yet to come into full faith in Christ. And it's an ever increasing journey. And that's why it's so important to understand it as a path, as a process of steady maturation over time, because the fruit is there. And I can tell you, I feel in my experience of life is so different now than it was a year ago, because of those deeper places of healing that I've received. And I've been on this journey for nearly 25 years.
Yeah, as you say that, Morgan, several things. First of all, I think you and I need to spend more time together because you're firing me up, and I think you're just
Yeah, me
hit,
too, buddy.
yeah, I
Me
think
too.
you're just hitting the nail on the head. Where it's like, as I've had the privilege of walking with people pastorally and in counseling, that like what you said, I think is a really significant point as far as that the gospel allows, throughout our lives, the opportunity to, I would say, to grieve. And that's something that I think that, Brene Brown really talks about that, how we're scared of loss and we're scared of grieving and we run from that. But that in the gospel, we can really grow in grace. But a lot of times that growth and that healing is kind of like, for all of us who kind of lived through the 70s as kids, is that green capped can of Bactine antiseptic spray where you skin your knee and a loving parent comes to spray that antiseptic. You're like, it's okay, I'm going to cover the
Yes.
wound and I'll lose the leg. It's too painful. But that God, in these moments, as I kind of walk with clients, that, okay, this is going to be this moment of celebration and this good thing. But, as your son or daughter hits this certain age, at age 5, it's going to allow you the opportunity to see, okay, well, this is how old, my parents were when my parents got divorced.
Yes.
And from
Yes.
5 to 7, for me personally, okay, my daughter's 6. There was about 2 years where after my parents' divorce where I really didn't even see my father, just because he was on the other side of
Mm-hmm.
town. He was pursuing his own choices. And so that opportunity in those different points in our child's life to kind of grieve in a fuller way and for things to come more into focus. And I think that's one of those things, to kind of go back to something you were saying as far as gospel fathers and the need for men. I think a lot of times we get to this place of resignation of like, well, I'm not going to fight for these men to walk with me because there's maybe maybe pride, pride that I don't need that.
Yes.
Or there's been
Yes.
disappointment where we've reached out to an older man, and when I was in my 20s, I would reach out to older men, and they were in their 40s, and I was thinking, hey, I'm sure they have all this free time, their kids aren't young, they should be able to respond to my phone
Right.
call. And now being in my 40s, realizing just the reality of life and responsibilities, that it wasn't an issue that I wasn't enjoyable. It's an issue of their own finiteness. And so, in one sense, the need for
Yep.
almost this large gospel posse of men walking with us to kind of address and grow in grace and address that woundedness. Um, and so this kind of leads into this question I've been wanting to
Yeah.
ask. It really stood out in your book, Morgan, where you share a story about your own father, and a story that he had shared with you from his childhood where his parents were struggling financially, and your grandparents were forced to declare bankruptcy. And when your father was 8 years old, his parents asked for his change jar in order to relocate the family from Pennsylvania to Florida. And you share in the book, just even for you, kind of questioning that trauma in your dad's heart and the impact that event had on your dad's young masculine heart, and the possible message he internalized of, okay, now it's up to me, as an 8-year-old, it's all on
Yes.
me. Or am I worthy of love when I provide financially, for my family? And you write, with every wound comes a lie, with every lie an agreement, with every agreement a vow. And like most of us, my dad is, you say, works, ceaselessly for decades, motivated by a deep and steadfast love for his family, but also no doubt by a wound, and through that wound a lie that suggests that this is the only path for life and for love. So I was just wondering if you could speak just to that importance for us as men to understand this father wound that is in all of us, as well as trying to understand our own father's woundedness.
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of beauty in that question. I wish we had a campfire, and
Yeah,
I
I do
wish we
too.
could
Yeah,
tell more
I'm on my
stories.
way to
We
Colorado,
really
Morgan.
need it. Please come. Please
Yeah.
come. It deserves it. I actually cut some
I'll
firewood
bring my fly
yesterday,
fishing
so
rod.
please,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah.
Yeah, Michael, these are deep waters. But I think what I'd say is what I've come to understand is we see things not as they are,
Hmm.
but as we are. We all see dimly. And that's what's so hopeful. As we are more healed, we will begin to see more and more clearly. I couldn't have explained to you what was going on in the soul of the 10-year-old with my dad when I told that story, but it wasn't until I was in my 30s that I could understand a little bit of what was happening in my own heart. And then it wasn't until my late 30s that I could have received enough healing to understand what was happening in my dad's heart. As you said, he also had a father. His father was terribly wounding, had 11 foster homes he lived in, and was an immigrant that was always struggling to survive. And so I think it's important to just know that we all carry wounds, and that's not a place of shame. That's actually a place of possibility, because the wounds are meant to guide us into healing. A wound ungrieved is a wound unhealed. But our stories will tell us something if we're willing to listen to them, if we're willing to tune in and be curious about the landscape of our soul. One of my friends told me this when we were deep into this message of becoming a king, of trying to live it out. He said, you know what? The problem with vacation is I go with me. He said, that's the problem.
Yeah.
What I need is a vacation away from me, right?
Yeah.
Like, we think a week in Hawaii is going to solve our problems, and then we get there and we realize we're just as bound up in Hawaii as we are at home. And just the idea is, we think as men we can just overcompensate for actually it's the wounded heart within us that's driving us to actually self-sabotage.
Mm-hmm.
And so until we get curious to listen to the texture of our life, we will not become students of our story, and we will not know how to be open to the particular grace that actually God's bringing. He will allow us to be wounded in our wounding so that it can be healed. Like the fascinating intimacy of God, his brilliance, his care, his playfulness, his precision, is that he will raise the condition of fatherlessness in us so that we can invite Christ to come and actually do a substantive healing of our masculine soul. And the same is true for the feminine heart. He will raise it to heal it. And when we are living out of an orphan place and we get raised, we think God is cruel, or we think he's holding out on us, or we think he can't be trusted, when in fact he's trying to say, son, do you notice the pattern? That you always land in this place of it's never enough, that you function out of scarcity, and one more dollar, and one more day, and one more vacation, and one more time golfing, or one more beer is never going to make you feel like you have abundance. And so he will continue to allow us to be in places of scarcity until we pause and say, it's not about the bank account. And it's not about the career. The issue is scarcity. And below the scarcity is a boy that has a story. And if you excavate your story, you may come to see, well, like one of my friends, he was 12 years old when his dad, who was a pastor, had an affair with the secretary. And he sat him down in the front yard and said, son, I'm leaving. You're the man of the house now. And so at 12, Michael, he was put in charge of the kingdom. And to this day, he lives with a fear of, is it going to be enough? Because it's all on me. Now, here's the beautiful part of it, is God has done so much healing and so much restoration. He's one of the most generous men I know. He actually has more of a sense of abundance than most men that I know, because he identified that the scarcity in his story had so much more to do with the 12-year-old boy in him that was trying to navigate a man's world. He did the work to identify the wound. Understand, a helpful question is, how are you feeling right now? When you feel scared, when you feel uncomfortable, when you feel disoriented, when you feel scramble, like I just need to scramble and make life work. If you ask the question, how do you feel? And then you ask the question, how old were you when you first felt that? It's fascinating, Michael. It's so hopeful, because my story that you just told about my dad in the change jar and coming in the lie of, I am loved when I provide financially. So fast forward, he wanted to be a marine biologist, but he also needed to make a bunch of money, because marine biologists don't make money, and I am only loved when I have money, because that's what he learned. The boy's soul learned, I am loved when I have money to give. So he became a doctor. He became a very influential doctor, taught laser surgery around the world, but he was not home. So out of love, plus a wounded heart, my dad was gone trying to make money. And all the while, I, as a boy, all I knew was my dad was a big deal. He was really good at what he did. People loved him, and I need to become like him. So I took that same woundedness and I drove to achieve. And so the story of Morgan Snyder for decades was a story that everything pointed to this statement: I am loved when I achieve. I am loved when I come through. And the problem is, when we live from the wound to the vow, and we live out of these agreements with lies, it's never enough. And I drove myself to exhaustion. And now what I can tell you is, through years of inviting Christ in, of receiving more healing, receiving more ministry, receiving grace in very particular ways, I can tell you that achievement no longer drives me. It's actually unattractive to me. I no longer have a list of boxes to check or uncheck. Writing this book was actually an act of obedience out of love. And it was a deeply costly initiative on every level of my experience as a human being. I've not done it for self-promotion. I've done it in love to offer what's been entrusted to my care. But I can tell you, 15 years ago, that absolutely would not have been my motivation. My motivation was, in the name of God, I am going to do these things to try to feel good, and I feel good when I am coming through, when I am achieving. And so everything comes down to, how have we cared for the broken, masculine, feminine heart within us, and what is the particular path God is inviting us to take into the fullness of restoration. And it's so hopeful, because this is available. This is the substance of the Christian life as a kingdom apprentice.
Yeah, and I think, even just what you were saying right there, as far as I heard you kind of speaking to, how do we feel in the midst of being scared and disoriented? And
Yes.
And I can't think of, two better words to describe maybe the kind of the cultural waters and the ethos and where people are at, like these past, 8 weeks, this past 2 months, in light of COVID-19, in so many ways, this kind of season of, I would say, forced stillness, where,
Yes.
we have this pace and rhythm that is just dramatically different than what, we have experienced in our lifetime. And, I was just wondering, that's something that you kind of speak to a lot in the book, as far as becoming good soil, and then entering into a slow and a steady process. And I think there's so much in our own hearts when we haven't processed or wrestled with those wounds or those deeper questions that you're kind of talking about. It's easier just to kind of run on the hamster wheel or live life on the bullet train going 200 miles an hour, where we miss the scenery of our own stories or other people that are kind of passing by at that rate of speed. And so I was just wondering, just your perspective, in light of just the past few weeks, what do you see as the opportunity for us to kind of really press in to kind of growing and becoming good soil as men and women? What you mean by that in the book, and maybe even the opportunity in light of this disorientation and this forced stillness in light of COVID-19, just to really kind of press into some of those areas.
Yeah, the temptation is to want to get back to normal, right? The temptation is to say, okay, if we can just get back to normal, as though normal was this amazing life that we had, right?
Yeah.
It's like we end up chasing our tail when, like you said, what's fascinating is there are windows of opportunity culturally, just like there's windows of opportunity in the human experience, that we are more accessible to God. An unplanned teen pregnancy, where all of a sudden you have the attention of these dear souls. What will you do in this moment? And then life gets back to normal. And so I believe that whatever else is happening with COVID-19, it is a time of shaking. There is a universal unrest around the world. We have never lived through this sort of opportunity where, Hebrews says there will be times of shaking. And in the shaking, what it will reveal is the things that cannot be shaken and the things that can be shaken. And we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And I don't think that's just general, theological, abstract ideas. I think God is speaking very particular, that there are things in our life that need to be exposed for what they are. In the Bible, it talked about more than anything else other than God and humans. The number one thing talked about are trees. And humans are often compared to trees. And when you look at a tree, the most important things about a tree are the things that you can't see. That's what Dallas Willard said in Divine Conspiracy. The most important things are always things that are invisible. And so it's not until a storm comes that we really understand the depth and breadth of the root system. It's not until a drought comes that we really understand the depth of the tap root. And if it's actually rooted in a table, the water table, where it can have constancy of life-giving water, even in seasons of drought. And Jeremiah talks about that's why the one who grows in confidence with God, who becomes a son, who becomes a daughter, becomes the kind of person who's described as one whose roots tap into the stream. And in seasons of drought, they even have the greenness of new life. And so I believe that whatever else is happening, we have an opportunity to give back our attention to the things that matter most. And the question is, what have we given our attention to? We do live in a particular age in human history. It's an unprecedented age, and there's a lot more to talk about with that, because that has little to do with COVID-19. But in our modern era of an information age and a technological revolution, we get more and more faster and faster. Mm-hmm. And so we are in an age that is cursed with superficiality of soul. We've become very shallow people. And that's just not an emotional description. That's a soulful reality. But the soul hasn't changed. And so my curiosity at this time in human history is, what if God, among other things, is looking for our attention? And what if he's trying to say, I'm inviting you to pause and just slow down a bit. And I want to ask you, what have you done with your attention? What have you done with your affection? I believe that that's the last great frontier in humanity, that God is after the restoration of our attention, that the modern era in technology has so reduced our attention to micro moments, and we are just incessant multitaskers, and our attention is so short-lived. And then our affections, we are meant to give God our heart, our mind, our soul, and our strength, that we have so little affection to give because we're simply exhausted. We're thin. We're weary. And Michael, it's so hopeful to me that in this time, whatever else is going on, what if just in small measure, but in fierce intentionality, we can say a little bit more, God. I will choose to slow down and give back my attention to the things that matter to you. And God, a little bit more, I'm going to be curious about my affections. And what would it be like to actually be honest with where I've gone with my heart? Who and what have I given my heart over to in the search for life? Because life won't get back to what it used to be, but it will find a new normal. We are so creative at adapting for better and for ill, but we are in a moment. And I would invite our friends and listeners around the globe that are tuning into this to seize the moment, to be curious about what God might be doing with our attention and our affection.
Morgan, I'm just so thankful, for your time today, and just, how the Lord, has and is using you. And, I definitely wish we were in front of that campfire and this conversation could go on longer. It's just been such a blessing and encouragement to me personally. And just wanted to ask you, where can our listeners, pick up a copy of Becoming a King, and where can they find you online?
Yeah, thank you. It's just an honor to invest back into your world. And if anything in this conversation has intrigued our friends out there, I just want to say there's more. There's more. It's an ancient path. It's not new, but it is being newly recovered, that it's available to all, but few people choose it. And it's always been so. History tells us that the gospel is always lost, and it's always recovered on the fringes by a few. Mm-hmm. It's just fascinating to look through history. We find the recovery of the gospel on the fringes by a few. And so I've set out to steward what's been entrusted to my care. And yeah, that's all available in podcasts and blogs. And Becoming a King, the book and the video series, is a wonderful way to invite people in through a video experience that just starts with some simple, big ideas, some big questions, some guided prayer. And then the study guide goes really deep for people that want to really go after it. But it's all available at becomingaking.com. And Michael, I feel moved to pray for the listeners out there in this moment. I've not ever done that on someone else's podcast, but
I was actually about to ask you if you would do that. Yeah, I was about to ask you if you would do that.
That's awesome. I've done so many interviews, but I've not had a single one where I felt like the Spirit said pray, but yeah, I'd like to. So, Jesus, Father, and Holy Spirit, we pause and just ingest this for a moment. We pause to breathe. We pause to slow. We pause to just align a little bit more with a soul's portion and a soul's pace. And God, I want to risk turning, I'll pray in the first person, just inviting listeners to pray with me. I want to risk just tuning into to be curious, God, about who you really are, about what you're really doing in my life, in this hour, and about how you want to actually do that. Holy Spirit, I'm asking for you to be the teacher that you promised to be, the guide, the friend. I pray, Spirit, that of this podcast, you would illuminate the particular treasures that you have for my soul on this day. What is the portion and what is the peace that you want to bring to my attention? And Jesus, I am asking for your power. The scriptures promise us that there is an all-surpassing power that comes from you, that you are embodied personal power, the same power that raised you from the grave, God. I'm asking for that resurrection life to come into my body, to come into my home, to come into my relationships, my finances, my work in the world. God, I'm asking for your power to come and illuminate and align my kingdom and that which you've entrusted to my care to align with your purposes, your plans, and your intentions. And Father, I confess that there's still parts in me that feel fear. And I'm asking for you to give me a revelation of your courage. There are parts of me that feel scarcity. I'm asking for a revelation of your abundance. Father, there's parts of me that operate independently. Even for you, I do it without you. And I'm asking in that place that you would bring a revelation of your affection, a revelation of your care, that you would manifest your fathering presence in my life, both directly and also through the lives of other trustworthy people, to bring parts and portions of your fathering heart that align with your intentions to bring more of you into more of me. God, on this day, I pause to just receive you. I receive your kingdom afresh. I receive your heart, your strength, your care, more of you into more of me. With everything in me today, God, I give you my yes afresh. I say yes to you. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, brother.
Yes. Great to be with you, Michael.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you've been enjoying the podcast, I'd really appreciate it if you would leave a review on iTunes or Facebook. If you know someone who might enjoy or be encouraged by the show, feel free to share the podcast with them. Your willingness to share the show is one of the best ways to help it grow. As always, thanks for listening. Until next time.